you very much. Well, thank you, everyone. Very pleased to be here. I've had a chance to hear a number of the other speeches, and they've all been outstanding. My topic is sustainability in an environment of economic uncertainty. And I hope for people in the audience who think about the topic of sustainability, you see a little bit of the dilemma in the topic itself, which is how can you subject the very topic of sustainability to an economic environment? If it's about sustainability, it has to be enduring and it has to go on. So I'd like to challenge us in this talk to think about sustainability as something that spans very long periods of time, but ultimately at the end of this try to get to what are some of the actions that we can take to try to improve our position in the near term. Let me start with a definition. At Owens Corning, we have a sustainability organization. We think about sustainability, and we've defined sustainability as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the world that we leave to the future. So a pretty simple definition, pretty balanced approach. It's not to say that we have to somehow go backwards in the present in order to get to where we need to be in the future, but that we can't compromise where we need to be in the future in order to meet the needs of the present. As a corporate leader, a lot of you who think about sustainability may think, you know, I'm part of the problem, or that corporations are part of the problem, and I would tell you I fervently believe corporations are part of the solution. My personal journey around the environment, around sustainability, really goes back to when it was very popular to talk about saving the planet. And I would see posters about saving the planet, and I didn't think the environmentalists who were making the case for saving the planet really got to the finish line of why this was important to people. And I think Jim Howden came up here and talked about how do you talk about difficult things that are important to our future and get dialogue going. I've always thought this poster about saving the planet needed to have a little tagline, which is what we're talking about here is saving the planet for humans. I think there's very little risk that the Earth will continue to go around the sun for millions of years. I think there's bigger risk whether or not human beings will actually be prospering and successful on that Earth for the millions of years that we would hope that to happen. And we have to think about this in terms of generations. So for each of us in our current economic circumstances to say, well, this is important, but in the near term, we have an unemployment issue in our country, or we have deficits in our country, we have to find a way to get started in this journey so that we, in fact, are making progress on this problem every single day. Now, one of the things that I think has dramatically confused this whole debate is everyone is trying to prove the existence of a problem. We talk about climate change, we talk about global warming, I think Thomas Friedman talked about global weirding. Everyone is trying to stake out a place that says, here is in fact the problem and I can prove it. And anytime you try to prove something, it automatically creates a counter-argument of I can prove whatever you're trying to prove is not true. I would take a different approach to the science. And the approach that I would take is to say, the big problem we have is, in fact, we're conducting a science experiment in the atmosphere. So when you think about what we're doing today, with burning a bunch of fossil fuels, putting them into the environment, we actually don't know what impact that's going to have in the future. And trying to prove whether, in fact, it's going to cause global warming, whether it's going to cause climate change, I think is really beside the point. The important question is, we only have one atmosphere. And if we're going to conduct a science experiment, it seems like a very bad place to do that, because if we're wrong about our predictions, it's very difficult to go backwards. So if there's one image that I would leave you with to think about is when you hear global climate change, when you hear people talk about global warming, I really think that's unimportant to the debate. I think what's important to the debate is why would we want to knowingly change the atmosphere of the one Earth we have when sustaining human life on this Earth should be one of our core objectives. Now, any discussion of sustainability, I would argue, starts first and foremost with energy policy. So the whole balance of this equation has to come back to how do we build energy policy that creates the right behaviors and puts us onto a sustainable path where, in fact, we can manage the environment the way it needs to be managed. In a discussion of energy policy, you're also having a very broad discussion of economic policy, of trade policy. Energy policy is at the root of our trade deficit. Energy policy is, in fact, at the root of most foreign relations conflicts. Energy policy is, in fact, at the root of most of our military expenditures. So solving energy policy in a holistic way for the country is critically important to the sustainability movement. How you go about solving it is a very difficult challenge because it's a big trillion-dollar industry with lots of big and sophisticated players, all of whom have a very difficult stake in the change that I would envision we need to make, and I'm going to talk about that a bit in the future. If you think about where we've come from, if you go back to kind of pre-industrial revolution, in most regards, all the sources of energy were, in fact, renewable and largely solar. So if you think about livestock, livestock ate grass, grass came from the sun. That's where the energy came to power farm implements. We had wind energy to grind our wheat. We had water wheels to grind our wheat. We had food, which we ate and farmed, and of course the food also came from kind of non-fertilized, naturally fertilized fields. So that was not a part of the hydrocarbon chain. It was, again, a part of the solar chain. So we had an agrarian economy that was built off of solar, wind, and water and renewable fuels. Of course, we weren't nearly as wealthy in this agrarian economy as we are today. What we've been able to accomplish in the last couple hundred years is we've actually taken a massive stored resource, which is all these fossil fuels which were put into the earth over hundreds of millions of years, and we've mined them out of the ground in centuries against something that was put there in hundreds of millions of years. So, in fact, it's not hard to look at that equation and realize that a battery that takes hundreds of millions of years to recharge can't be depleted in 2 centuries and have an idea of how we're going to do something next beyond the depletion of that battery. And in fact, I don't think the debate is being framed this way at all constructively. So people are not talking about, they get into the debate of peak oil and when will we hit peak oil, and they get into the debate of now that we've found shale gas in parts of this country, how can we use that shale gas to bring a balance to our energy resources? And in fact, all of those debates are denying the simple fact that this energy that we have such an interest in terms of advancing our standard of living was put into the earth over hundreds of millions of years. And when we talk about taking it out, we're talking about taking it out in decades. And for the mathematicians in the room, it's very hard to contemplate how 6 or 7 additional zeros on the end of a number really do change dramatically the time periods. It's not getting any better. So if you look at electric consumption, here's the US and here's the world. Obviously, we continue to consume more and more electricity, and obviously we are the biggest consumers of electricity. If you look at electricity production in the United States, you can see the slice here, which is fossil fuels, has continued to be, over the last 30 years, the fastest growing segment of electricity production in the United States. So we can look at this and say it is an accelerating problem, and it's a problem that is clearly not sustainable. And if in fact we don't address it at the root cause of where do the sources of energy come from, there's really no ability to put your arms around this problem and wrestle it to the ground. Now, the question of how long we can sustain the current policy we have, I would submit to you is the wrong question. So again, trying to prove that we can do this for 30 more years because peak oil is 30 years out is denying the existence of the long-run problem, which is it's very clear this problem cannot continue to operate in the way it's currently operating. Really, the right question is, can we continue to pump oil out of the ground and just light it on fire? So when Mother Nature gave us this wonderful resource of all of this energy, which also is a great material system that goes into pharmaceuticals, that goes into materials that are used in our everyday lives, and then you look at the percent of these fuels that are actually just being pumped out of the ground and in the simplest of terms, just lit on fire. This is not in any way, shape, or form an energy policy that can be sustained in economic times or in good economic times or in difficult economic times, and we're going to need to take action. What are the solutions? You heard in the introduction that at Owens Corning, we are focused on energy efficiency in construction with our insulation products. We're also very active in wind energy. So we tend to look pretty broadly at what are the policy solutions or economics of the different energy solutions that can potentially be a part of solving this problem. We would say that we don't believe you need to be impatient about solving this problem in a year or even in a decade. We would say we have to be impatient about getting started on solving this problem because we absolutely believe that the solution is going to be decades or even centuries in length. And the longer we wait to get started, the harder it is to get closer to the solution. So the impatience in my talk, or the impatience in my point of view, would be very much driven on the need to get started in an active debate about what really are the solutions and get serious about chasing them versus actually believing that this is a problem that we can solve even maybe in one generation. the four main sustainable sources, I don't think this is big news to anybody in this room. You've got solar, you've got wind, you've got tidal, and then we would always put on a fourth, which is energy efficiency. So certainly using less of an energy source is the cheapest, generally highest return, and best form of renewable energy is to never use the energy in the first place. We would look at energy efficiency and say that is, from both a policy point of view as well as an actionability point of view, a just go do. So that's something every person in this room can be involved in. That's something that is easily mandated or regulated from a government point of view. It's something where people can take their own energy and find a way to get involved in energy efficiency or in energy reduction projects in the choices you make in your life. Clearly, in the near term, we would say wind has the best economics, and we have seen large-scale wind development, and one of the things that stands in the way of larger-scale wind development is good uses of the electricity that's generated in wind because it's an intermittent resource. So for industry, it's very difficult for us to take electricity that sometimes is on, sometimes is off. There are big parts of our economy, and I'll talk about automotive, where in fact you can use intermittent electrical sources to charge batteries and then drive electrical vehicles. So we think wind has a lot more opportunity for big scale production, particularly in the United States, but in a lot of parts of the world, and to go offshore. But finally, and most obviously, the most pervasive source of energy for the Earth is solar. And finding economic methodologies to build solar capability into the energy supply chain is going to be critical to addressing this problem or solving this problem. Now, the first answer, we believe, is obvious, using radically less. Today, if you look at residential commercial construction, we consume about 40% of the energy in the United States in buildings just like this in our homes. Most of us don't actually understand that there's more energy consumed in residential commercial buildings than there are in the transportation industry, than there is in industrial America. So the single largest user of energy is residential and commercial construction. There's simple known technologies today that can reduce the amount of consumption in residential commercial buildings by 30%. So this is just the will to spend our money in our homes on energy efficiency and the energy efficiency of our home versus granite countertops versus stainless steel appliances versus tile backsplashes. So when you look at the choices that we make when we buy our homes, the infrastructure of our country, the infrastructure of our home is being built one site at a time, and the individuals buying those houses are making decisions that affect the energy future and the infrastructure future of our country. This is an obvious place crying out for a regulatory framework that demands higher and higher efficiency levels in all construction, and then goes back and looks at retrofitting existing buildings and also making them much more energy efficient. Today, you can find pretty economic approaches to net zero construction. So new construction homes that are using renewable sources as an offset, but use such little energy in their construction and such little energy in their use that those offsets are relatively inexpensive, and in fact, that home can be deemed a net zero home. In Germany, they're actually building homes today called passive house, and many of you I know are architect students or studying design, where in fact the heat of the people living in the dwelling provides most of the heat during the winter months. And these are houses that can be good-looking houses with very low levels of renewable energy sources to power them, where in fact they need no other energy source at all. So there's a clear path here, I think, if there were a will. And one of, I think, the classically American challenges is the belief that our home is an expression of our individuality, and as a result, these are choices I get to make. And from a policy point of view, we would believe very strongly that these are choices that maybe not need to be government mandated, but certainly minimum standards need to be set, minimum standards need to be met, and incentive and penalties need to be put in place for people who are above those standards or below those standards until the behaviors of energy efficiency in residential commercial buildings are met. So you don't normally see a lot of corporate executives standing up and wanting to talk about more regulation. You don't typically hear us standing up in public and talking about more taxes. But in fact, in order to get the behaviors that we need, we can't deny the issue that the energy efficiency of my structure is not just my right, and that it's actually a community right, it's a communal right, it's a societal right, because the energy that I'm consuming affects all of us. The next place to go clearly is the electrification of transportation. We need to take liquid fuels out of transportation. You can get enough torque, you can get enough power out of batteries in order to move most vehicles. and with renewable energy sources, which are not, baseload power. You cannot rely on them on call. You certainly can expect charging cars through the night, charging cars in parking lots during the day, that there will be enough solar and wind power available to keep a fleet of vehicles charged, and that fleet of vehicles can therefore provide most of the transportation needs of most people. I think we're seeing some progress in this, but certainly it's an area where moving more quickly to build the infrastructure on this and moving more quickly to make it economically viable to want to operate an electric vehicle is very, very important. I would argue a very simple way to make this happen is to raise the price of gasoline. Again, a very, very unpopular idea, but solar and wind become much more viable in electric cars if gasoline is $5 or $6 at the pump versus $3.69 or $3.49 at the pump. Again, a place where we have to have an incentive, but also a penalty for poor behaviors. We have challenges. So there are things like air transportation and other places where liquid fuels pack so much punch that it's hard to imagine, at least in known technologies, how we're going to be able to electrify all parts of the transportation chain. But if you take energy out of residential commercial buildings, you take energy or liquid energies or fossil energies out of carbon fuels, it's very easy to see where we would have a very narrow use for fossil fuels in some of the places where they are actually desperately needed. When you think about affecting change, I'd like to walk through kind of two examples. The classic two ways to make things happen are a carrot and a stick. So you can incentivize good behavior or you can penalize bad behavior. I've talked a bit about that. If you think about the places we've seen change, smoking, smoking rates in the country have dropped from 40% to about 25% over the last 2 decades, and we've taxed it like crazy and we've outlawed it. And we've taken a behavior and we've not been neutral in our view as to whether or not smoking is a good thing or a bad thing societally. We've been willing to say we don't want a society of smokers. We've been willing to put taxes on it. And we've sustained that because governments are actually much better at taking in taxes than they are at using subsidies to pay out. They eventually run out of money when they pay out. They're much better at taxing bad behaviors than they are at incentivizing good behaviors. I think we have a very recent example of that. Many of you have been probably following the company Solyndra. Here's a case of the government giving a $550 million loan to try to commercialize solar power, and within 12 months the company's bankrupt and can't pay back the loan. We would certainly not feel that governments are in a position to pick winners and losers. We certainly don't think governments should be in the business of giving loans to companies to commercialize technologies that they don't understand. Investors can form the capital to do this. Investors can go take the risk. Investors can take the losses if the losses incur. The way you have to do that is you have to make people pay for carbon. So we would feel very strongly that carbon taxes and raising the cost of energy in a slow and consistent but ever-increasing way eventually brings in more viable wind technology, it brings in more viable electric car technology, it then brings in more viable solar technology. It makes the return on capital or the return on investment of energy efficiency projects in construction go up, not down. And then private capital, like corporations, participate in the solution because we see how we can take good investments and make good return on investment by investing against the elimination of what becomes a very dear and valuable asset, which is energy. And as energy becomes more dear and more valuable, obviously behaviors would change in terms of people trying to use less of it and replace it with other forms of capital. Hopefully, for most of you, there's some refreshment in seeing corporations standing up and saying, we think we need more taxes, and we need more taxes in certain areas. This is the debate that we believe needs to be made more public and more clear in the way we talk about this problem. Now, when we look at the long road, and it is a very, very long road, the trick to winning any race is no matter how long the road is, you have to go get started. And hopefully in the short time that I've had to spend with you, I've been able to give you some images and ways to think about this problem that would cause each of us to be able to bring other people into the dialogue around sustainability and cause them to see that this is a long-term problem and this is a problem that affects all of us, and that we don't need to be right about the scientific facts to want to get in action about making change. Thank you.